The United States is waking up to a geopolitical reality that many didn't see coming. Mexico, America's southern neighbor and vital trading partner, has just deployed naval vessels to Cuba in what appears to be a direct response to mounting pressure from the Trump administration. This isn't just another diplomatic spat or routine military exercise. What we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in hemispheric power dynamics that could reshape North American relations for decades to come. Mexico's decision to send ships to Cuban waters represents something far more significant than a simple show of solidarity with Havana. It's a calculated move that signals Mexico City's willingness to push back against what it perceives as American overreach, and it comes at a moment when Trump's hardline policies on immigration, tariffs, and border security have driven relations between Washington and Mexico City to their lowest point in generations. The timing is no coincidence. As Trump threatens new tariffs and border closures, Mexico is demonstrating that it has options and allies that extend beyond its northern border. This development forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Has American foreign policy pushed a critical ally into making common cause with nations that Washington considers adversaries? Now, to understand what's really happening here, we need to step back and look at the broader context, because nothing in geopolitics happens in isolation. The relationship between the United States and Mexico has always been complex, often fraught with tension, but also deeply interdependent in ways that most Americans don't fully appreciate. Mexico is not just another neighboring country, it's America's third largest trading partner, with bilateral trade exceeding $700 billion annually. The economies of both nations are so intertwined that disruptions in one immediately cascade into the other. American factories depend on Mexican components, Mexican consumers buy American products, and millions of people cross the border legally every single day for work, family, and commerce. This is the foundation upon which the entire North American economic architecture is built. But something has changed, and it's been building for quite some time now. The Trump administration's approach to Mexico has been, to put it mildly, confrontational from the very beginning. We've seen threats of border walls paid for by Mexico, threats of massive tariffs on Mexican goods, threats to tear up NAFTA and its successor agreement, the USMCA, and a general rhetoric that portrays Mexico as somehow taking advantage of the United States. Now, whether you agree with these characterizations or not, the effect has been to alienate a government in Mexico City that was already dealing with its own domestic pressures, its own security challenges, and its own nationalist sentiments. The Mexican government, like any government, cannot be seen as simply capitulating to American demands without consequence. There's a domestic political dimension here that Washington seems to have miscalculated. When we look at Mexico's decision to send naval vessels to Cuba, we have to understand this as part of a pattern. Mexico has been quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, expanding its diplomatic and economic relationships with countries that the United States views with suspicion or outright hostility. We've seen increased Mexican engagement with China, deepening ties with Russia in certain sectors, and now this very visible demonstration of support for Cuba. Cuba, of course, has been under American sanctions for more than 6 decades. It's a small island nation, 90 miles from Florida, that Washington has sought to isolate and pressure into submission for generations. The fact that Mexico is now willing to send ships there, knowing full well how this will be perceived in Washington, tells us something very important about the state of US-Mexico relations. It tells us that Mexico City has reached a point where it's willing to accept the political costs of defying American preferences. Let's think about what this means in practical terms. When Mexico sends ships to Cuba, it's not just a symbolic gesture, although symbolism matters enormously in international relations. These are actual military assets being deployed to waters that the United States has long considered part of its sphere of influence. The Caribbean has been viewed by Washington as essentially an American lake since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which declared that European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere. That doctrine has been extended informally, to suggest that any foreign military presence in the Caribbean requires American approval or at least American acquiescence. Mexico is now challenging that assumption directly by sending ships to Cuba without seeking Washington's blessing. Mexico is asserting its own sovereignty and its own right to conduct foreign policy independent of American preferences. We also need to consider the Cuban perspective here because Cuba is not a passive player in this drama. The Cuban government has been under enormous pressure for decades, facing American sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic hardship. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 removed Cuba's primary benefactor and protector, leaving the island economically devastated. Since then, Cuba has had to navigate a very difficult path, seeking new allies and new sources of economic support, while maintaining its political system and its independence from American influence. Venezuela provided some relief for a time with subsidized oil shipments, but Venezuela's own economic collapse has reduced its ability to support Cuba. China and Russia have stepped in to some degree, but their assistance has been limited. Mexico's engagement, therefore, represents a potential lifeline for Cuba, and Cuban leaders are surely welcoming this development with considerable satisfaction. But there's another layer to this that we need to examine, and that's the question of why Mexico would take this step now. What has changed to make this calculated provocation worthwhile from Mexico City's perspective? The answer, I think, lies in the accumulation of grievances and the sense that the traditional relationship with Washington is no longer serving Mexican interests. Trump's tariff threats have been particularly damaging, not just economically but psychologically. The threat to impose tariffs unless Mexico does more to stop migration, to stop drug trafficking, to basically do America's bidding on its own territory, has been perceived in Mexico as fundamentally disrespectful. It treats Mexico as a subordinate rather than as a sovereign nation with its own interests and priorities. And this comes on top of decades of what many Mexicans see as American interference in their internal affairs, American support for policies that benefit American interests at Mexican expense, and a general attitude of condescension from Washington. The migration issue is particularly sensitive because it's often framed in American political discourse as if Mexico is somehow responsible for creating the problem, but the reality is far more complex. Many of the migrants passing through Mexico are not Mexican at all. They're coming from Central America, from South America, from the Caribbean, fleeing violence, poverty, and instability that are often the legacy of American foreign policy interventions in those regions. Mexico finds itself caught in the middle, pressured by the United States to stop the flow of migrants while also dealing with humanitarian concerns and its own limited resources. The Trump administration's approach has been to essentially demand that Mexico solve this problem or face economic punishment, and this has generated enormous resentment. On the issue of drug trafficking, again, we see a similar dynamic. The United States is the world's largest consumer of illegal drugs. American demand drives the entire illicit drug trade in the Western Hemisphere. Mexican cartels have become extraordinarily powerful and violent precisely because there's such an enormous profitable market for their products in the United States. Yet the American political discourse often treats this as purely a Mexican problem, as if Mexico is exporting drugs to corrupt innocent Americans. The reality, of course, is that this is a shared problem requiring shared solutions, but the Trump administration's rhetoric has tended to blame Mexico while downplaying American responsibility for drug consumption and the flow of weapons from the United States into Mexico that arm the cartels. All of this creates a context in which the Mexican government feels it has very little to lose by pushing back against American pressure. If Washington is going to threaten tariffs anyway, if Washington is going to blame Mexico for problems that are fundamentally transnational in nature, if Washington is going to treat Mexico as a subordinate rather than a partner, then why should Mexico continue to accommodate American preferences on issues like Cuba? This is the calculation that seems to be driving Mexican policy, and it's a rational calculation given the circumstances. Now, let's talk about what this means for the broader geopolitical landscape, because this isn't just about US Mexico relations or US Cuba relations. This is about the shifting balance of power in the Western Hemisphere and indeed globally. For decades, the United States has enjoyed unchallenged dominance in its own hemisphere. Latin American countries might have disagreed with American policies, they might have pursued independent foreign policies to some degree, but there was always an understanding that when it really mattered, American power and American preferences would prevail. That understanding is now breaking down, and not just with Mexico. We've seen similar patterns in Brazil, in Argentina, in other Latin American countries that are increasingly willing to pursue relationships with China, with Russia, with other powers that offer alternatives to American dominance. China's role here is particularly significant. Chinese investment in Latin America has grown exponentially over the past 2 decades. China is now a major trading partner for most Latin American countries, and in some cases, it's the largest trading partner, surpassing the United States. Chinese infrastructure projects, Chinese loans, Chinese technology, all of this has given Latin American countries options they didn't have before. They're no longer solely dependent on American capital, American markets, or American approval. This fundamentally changes the diplomatic calculus. When Mexico engages more deeply with Cuba, knowing that Washington will object, it can do so partly because it knows it has alternative economic partners in China and elsewhere who are happy to deepen their relationships with Mexico. Russia's role is somewhat different but also important. Russia doesn't have the economic weight in Latin America that China has, but Russia has been making strategic inroads, particularly in the military and energy sectors. Russian military equipment, Russian energy technology, Russian diplomatic support. All of this has been offered to countries that feel they're being pressured or neglected by Washington. Russia sees Latin America as an opportunity to challenge American influence and to create complications for the United States in its own backyard, just as the United States has done to Russia in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So when we see Mexico sending ships to Cuba, we should understand that this is happening in a context where multiple great powers are competing for influence in the Western Hemisphere in ways that haven't been seen since the Cold War. The Trump administration's response to all of this has been, frankly, counterproductive. Rather than recognizing that heavy-handed pressure is pushing Mexico and other Latin American countries away, the response has been to double down on threats and confrontation. This is classic overreach. It's the kind of behavior we see from a declining hegemon that's trying to maintain its dominance through coercion rather than through attraction and partnership. The irony is that this approach accelerates the very trends it's meant to reverse. Every threat of tariffs, every insulting comment about Mexico, every demand that Mexico subordinate its interests to American priorities pushes Mexico further away and makes alternative relationships with China, Russia, and yes, Cuba more attractive. We should also consider the timing of Mexico's move in the context of American domestic politics. Trump is dealing with multiple challenges at home, from economic concerns to political divisions to legal issues. His administration is distracted and internally divided on many fronts. Mexico's leadership may have calculated that this is precisely the moment to assert Mexican independence when Washington is less able to respond effectively. It's a calculated gamble, but it's one that seems to be based on a realistic assessment of American capacity and will to impose costs on Mexico for this kind of defiance. There's also a generational shift happening in Mexican politics and society that we need to account for. Younger Mexicans, those who have grown up in the era of NAFTA and economic integration, have a different view of the relationship with the United States than previous generations. They're more confident, more nationalistic in certain ways, and less willing to accept the idea that Mexico should automatically defer to American preferences. They've seen American policy failures, American political dysfunction, and American decline in relative terms, and they question why Mexico should tie its future so closely to a partner that seems increasingly unreliable. This generational shift is reflected in Mexican politics and is giving Mexican leaders more domestic political space to challenge Washington. The economic implications of this deteriorating relationship are profound and potentially catastrophic for both countries. If we see a serious rupture between the United States and Mexico, if tariffs are actually imposed at significant levels, if border crossings are seriously disrupted, the economic damage will be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. American consumers will pay higher prices for everything from automobiles to agricultural products. American manufacturers will see their supply chains disrupted, leading to production delays and lost competitiveness. Mexican workers will lose jobs, Mexican businesses will suffer, and the Mexican economy could slide into recession. This is lose-lose, and yet the current trajectory seems to be heading exactly in that direction, because neither side feels it can back down without appearing weak. The security implications are equally serious. Mexico and the United States have cooperated, however imperfectly, on counter-narcotics efforts, on counter-terrorism, on border security, and on intelligence sharing. If this relationship breaks down, if Mexico decides it has no incentive to cooperate with American security priorities, the consequences could be severe. We could see an increase in drug trafficking, an increase in illegal migration, and a general deterioration of security along the border and beyond. Mexico could choose to reduce cooperation on these issues as a form of leverage or retaliation, and the United States would find it very difficult to address these challenges unilaterally. What we're witnessing, then, is not just a diplomatic spat or a temporary disagreement. We're witnessing a fundamental realignment of power and relationships in North America and the broader Western Hemisphere. Mexico's decision to send ships to Cuba is a symptom of this deeper shift, a visible manifestation of changes that have been building for years. It represents Mexico's assertion of independence, its willingness to challenge American dominance, and its search for a foreign policy that serves Mexican interests rather than simply accommodating American demands. Whether this leads to a complete rupture or whether both sides eventually find a way to step back from the brink remains to be seen. But what's clear is that the old relationship, based on American dominance and Mexican acquiescence, is over. A new relationship is being forged, and it's being forged in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion, resentment, and competition rather than cooperation and partnership. The question now is whether American leadership recognizes this reality and adjusts accordingly, or whether it continues down a path of confrontation that can only end badly for everyone involved.